Welcome back to the How to Podcast series. My name is Dave. Welcome to all my avatars. Bad habit. Listeners, thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of the How to Podcast series family. I want to talk about something that impacts many podcasters. Unfortunately, it's called Podfade. I've never heard the term before. Podfade is basically when you have a podcast and over time you basically fade away and your podcast stops. Now, I've listened to some really amazing podcasts. Started back at day one, caught up to the recent episodes, and then they become part of my listening habits. And for some reason, for multiple reasons, I guess, the podcast just seems to stop. And the gap between each episode gets larger. The episodes get shorter. They're not as frequent. And eventually they just stop. And as a listener, that's disappointing because you really connect with your podcast host. They become part of your life. They become part of your routine, something you look forward to. So when you're looking at creating a podcast, there's three major podcast causes as far as podcast fade. And I wanted to kind of talk about that with you today. So not enough time. Number one, you just don't have enough time to do this. You've got great expectations. You anticipate that your calendar can squeeze in podcast recording, setting up interviews, editing, creating all the documents, research, all the stuff that goes on before, during, and after the podcast is recorded. And those things can really eat up your time. So be really realistic with your time. Where does your time responsibilities lie? Is there extra time available? And commit to that. Commit to the time that it takes to create a weekly, daily, monthly, whatever that is for you, whatever the frequency, but commit to the time it takes to do that and be realistic with yourself. Don't come out all guns blazing. I'm going to do a daily podcast 7 days a week for the rest of my life. It might not happen, really. And just be realistic with yourself. Be realistic with your time. And I would say start slow. And you can always add. It's harder to go backwards. It's easier to go forwards. So insufficient time. Not enough time. One of the reasons for pod fade. Number two, the content. When you don't have enough content and you struggle to put together your thoughts for the next episode, that will cause gaps. That will cause breaks. Some people use seasons for that. And they use seasons as an excuse to take a long, extended sabbatical from doing podcast recording, and your audience just falls away. So make sure you have content. For one of the podcasts that we have in production right now, it's a music-based podcast. And as a musician, I love doing podcasts about music because there's so much to talk about. I think I have 35 episodes pre-written, just a basic skeleton of what I want to talk about and the songs I want to talk about. 35. They're all in the list, and every time I get one, I just add it to my list. So 36, 37, it just keeps going up and up. So I have more content than I have time at this point to record them all. So I don't have a very small bucket of content to draw from. I have a fire hose of content to draw from. So, and I see no end in sight. As far as new music comes out all the time, new bands, new things that I can talk about. So, yeah. Find out and establish at the beginning how much content is available to you. Don't run out. Don't pick a topic that's going to run out in 5 episodes and you don't know what to do next. If your plan is to do this podcast long term. Nothing wrong with having 5 episodes as a podcast. If you can do the entire content and get it done, that's a great option. But if you're looking at doing a podcast over time with a long-term goal for your podcast, make sure you have the content. So not enough time, not enough content. Lastly, not enough prep. So when you are doing your podcast, There is a lot of stuff that comes into play when you do a podcast recording, and it's tough. And I think the one thing too that's really hard in the prep time is the loneliness that can happen, especially if you don't have interviews in your podcast and it's just you and your voice every week, and you're sitting in your little room and by yourself and hitting record and wondering if anybody's even going to listen to this episode or not. It can get a little bit lonely. So when you are preparing your podcast, you need to think about the long-lasting podcast focus and goal in mind, and not just focus on each episode one at a time, but think about your listener and where you want to go with this listener over time. Remember, it is impossible to create a good and lasting podcast without doing the necessary research, groundwork, and laying some strong foundation for your show. And we talk about that with your why. That was one of our earlier episodes. Go back and listen to that if you have a chance. But knowing your why will help you in your prep. Knowing your why will help you as a filter to know what guests to have on your podcast and what guests you don't need to have on your podcast. Your why will be your grounding, your focus, your target for everything that you do. So 3 major causes of podfade. And don't let them happen to you. Don't run out of time. Don't run out of content, and don't run out of preparation. Keep it in mind. Hey, and if you're interested, we're starting a little podcast mastermind group. I'm looking for 5 mastermind members. And it's going to be for 6 months is what I'm asking for from your commitment. I'm not asking for a penny. Nothing. We're going to get together. We're going to do meetups. We're going to do podcast shares. We're going to share tips. We're going to listen to each other's podcasts and give feedback. We're going to be there for each other. So like I said, when you're alone in your podcast journey and you just need somebody out there, another set of ears to listen and guide you and give you some comments and some direction, do it in a group setting. It's much better when you have people who have your back, people who will give you reviews, people who will give you likes, and people who will share your podcast. You're not on your own in this. And the podcast journey can feel like that at times. So let's do this 6 months, 5 people to help me create this mastermind group. Contact us today through truemediasolutions.ca. Let's get this together. Let's get our podcast going. Let's get up and running. And I look forward to talking again soon. So next episode, we're going to be talking about our 5 tips to avoid podfade. We know what causes them. Now, how do we avoid them? That's coming up. So 5 tips to avoid podfade will be coming soon. Come back here, hit that subscribe, hit that button so that you're notified of all the updates for the podcast, all the new episodes. And thanks for adding us to your day. Appreciate it. And good luck with what you're doing. Send me a message. Let me know about your new podcast. I want to listen to it. I want to give you some likes and help share your new journey. Send them to me, okay? Thanks for listening to the How to Podcast series. Cheers, guys. Have a good day.